What if just one tick bite suddenly made your favorite steak or backyard burger something you can't eat? Welcome back to Rooted and Restless. I'm your host, Marianne Smith Edge. Today's episode may be a little different than what we talk about, but it still does revolve around food and farming. Because we're talking about a pest, and it is spring and summer, that affects us whether we garden, hike, or farm. And to talk about this little pest and parasite tick, I have a guest who definitely has a lot of knowledge and has been very vigilant over the last 2 years of educating our communities, not only in Kentucky, but around the country. My guest today is Dr. Heather Norman-Bergdolf. Heather is a PhD nutritionist and an assistant extension professor in the Department of Dietetics and Human Nutrition at the University of Kentucky and co-director of the University of Kentucky Food for Health Alliance. In her education, she has worked with extension specialists throughout the university to really help inform us how a tick bite actually has some pretty serious effects when it comes to reactions that may occur. A syndrome that you might have heard, alpha-gal syndrome. So Heather, thank you so much you're a very busy woman, so thank you so much for spending a little time today to talk about this little pest that you and I never thought that the two of us with backgrounds in nutrition would talk about ticks, but the reality, we are. So perhaps let's kind of give us a little background of why we're even having this conversation in the first place.
Marianne, it's so good to spend time with you. I will talk about whatever you want to, whenever you want to, because it's always such a joy. We've kind of been thrust into this world of figuring out what alpha-gal syndrome is and how we can best support our people, our Kentuckians. So like you mentioned, I serve as an extension specialist here at the University of Kentucky. So I'm kind of supporting our county level agents when it comes to their food nutrition programming. And we are grassroots. So we start with what those local needs are, and it rises to the top here on campus. And then we respond and make sure that our agents are equipped. And over the last 2 years, it has been nonstop, the need for education, support, and resources regarding alpha-gal syndrome. So like you mentioned, this is a topic neither of us ever thought we would talk about. I have nutritional sciences training, and I certainly did not learn about this in graduate school, but just the nature of it and having to be responsive, we're looking to the science and trying to translate that into a way that makes sense for people. And so alpha-gal syndrome, when it comes to food nutrition, is top of mind because that is the one way that we're able to kind of manage this specific syndrome that currently doesn't have a cure.
Well, and maybe we talk, I know you're not a bug person necessarily, but maybe we just talk a little bit about who the culprit is, because growing up on a farm dealing with the old American dog tick, we all knew about that. And of course, there are some potential diseases associated with this. But this is the Lone Star culprit. And we mentioned Kentucky, but the reality is a lot of us in the southern part, Midwest, and now even up in the Northeast are affected by the Lone Star tick, right?
So you're right. You're right. Right now in the United States, the main culprit for alpha-gal syndrome is the Lone Star tick, which the adult females are known because they have that large white dot on their back is where we kind of get that Lone Star name from. And we're seeing that the places across the U.S. where the Lone Star tick usually has spread, and it's emerging in new spaces. So even here in Kentucky, it is becoming one of the main ticks that you will find out there, kind of overtaking some of the other common ones like you had mentioned. And so essentially what alpha-gal syndrome is a food and drug allergy that is induced or triggered by the bite from specifically the Lone Star tick. In the U.S., that is the most common tick that we have science to support. But alpha-gal syndrome is on every continent except Antarctica and is tied to other tick species. So not to say that there aren't others out there, but in Kentucky and in especially the Southeast, it is primarily the Lone Star tick.
So when so I think it's interesting to explain why why the bite causes the allergy to red meat.
Yes. So the name alpha-gal itself is short for kind of a complicated sugar molecule name. So galactose alpha 1,3 galactose is a mouthful, and we're not going to go around and saying that. So that's where we get alpha-gal from. But specifically, that is the sugar molecule that people are developing this sensitization to that is causing their food and drug allergy. And so the science is still out on essentially how is it this specific tick is carrying this sugar molecule in its mouth. And again, I'm not an entomologist. I don't know all the correct terms of mouth parts or whatever. But, once it bites a human and has that sugar molecule in its mouth, it's introducing a foreign body directly into the bloodstream of the human. And so the body may mount an immune response, which results in this IgE mediated food and drug allergy, so that the next time you're exposed to that same allergen, your body is going to have that allergic reaction. And so this specific sugar molecule is only found in non-primate mammals. So essentially, humans and old world primates are the only mammals that don't naturally have this sugar. And so that's why we see it as foreign. So for those who maybe have alpha-gal syndrome, you're aware one of the main ways, and we will certainly get to this, to manage is to eliminate all mammalian-based foods and ingredients in order for you to avoid any reactions in the future. And so there's some that say there originally it was thought that once a tick maybe bit a mammal that was a host, so maybe a cow out in the field or deer, which is a major driver of the spread here, they acquired the alpha-gal, then they bit a human and then introduced that molecule. But now there's some pretty strong science to say that we think maybe the tick itself actually can create the sugar molecule and doesn't have to acquire it from a host. Some of the strongest evidence is that we know that even larval stages of the Lone Star tick could also cause alpha-gal syndrome. So maybe a tick age-wise that hasn't actually bitten on a different host first. So maybe there is some way that the tick itself is creating the sugar and then introducing it. But the science is really still out confirming how the tick acquires alpha-gal.
Well, I mean, the way you describe it, it suddenly makes us all want to go inside probably and never go outside. But, and we'll talk about that because, we can't live like that perhaps. But let's dive into, as you mentioned, is that immediately is like, oh, that's the red meat. But the reality is, and you've alluded to this, it's really more than red meat, at least for some folks. I know the list is beware of dairy products as well. So why dairy plus red meat?
Certainly. So I think we're doing a good job of moving away from the name red meat allergy. And you will still see that out there, especially in the popular press. It kind of grabs people's attention as a headline. But it is much more than red meat. If you talk to someone who has alpha-gal syndrome, they'll probably say, I wish it was just red meat, so that it would be easier to identify, because it's not like our other food allergies where it is a specific ingredient, say milk, soy, or wheat, where it will clearly say that on the label what it is. So that's one of the complicating factors here. So yes, it is going to be our red meat, and dairy is also included. And the one reason for that is that in mammals, alpha-gal is not just this kind of little sugar that's floating around on its own. It's often attached to other lipids and proteins. So not to get too biochemistry here, but these are things we call like glycolipids or glycoproteins, which basically means you have this little sugar tag, in this case alpha-gal, attached to another important molecule. And those are found in almost every cell type and fluids and secretions from mammals. And that includes the milk that they are making and that we potentially would drink or use to make our dairy foods. Something to kind of keep in mind, though, is that alpha-gal really likes to be attached to lipids and to fat. So when we think about mammal-based foods, such as cuts of meat or even dairy, it's going to be higher in items that are higher in fat. So a fatty cut of meat or even organ meats are going to have higher amounts of alpha-gal than say maybe a leaner cut of meat. Now that's not to say that anyone with alpha-gal can have lean meat, but I'm just saying the amount might be lower. And then when dairy, there are some people with alpha-gal who can tolerate skim dairy items because all the fat's been skimmed off, but it's really full fat dairy that is problematic because you still have all that lipid, all that fat kind of, that comes to the top. And that's where the alpha-gal most likely is attached to the fat that is a part of that food. So this is a perfect example where management for someone with alpha-gal could be completely different than their next door neighbor who also has alpha-gal. Some people can tolerate dairy, some can't at all. Some maybe can eat certain mammalian-based foods so they can tolerate pork but not beef. So really it is very, very individualized, and that's just we don't understand why. But we do see some of these consistencies across higher fat items, products, especially, protein sources in our dairy foods.
And that's a great fact because I really hadn't necessarily heard the fat connection, per se, and I think that's important. And you alluded to the fact of, and in my limited connection, not only from what the information you've provided, but talking to a few people, you're right. It seems to be there's no consistency, of
Yes, that's what you'll hear is the most consistent thing about alpha-gal syndrome is the inconsistencies themselves between reactions, timing, the types of foods that are triggers, or even personal care items. So it is very complex, and it takes a lot of time. And you mentioned the lipid piece, so I'm not sure if we're going to get to this, but one of the hallmarks about this food allergy is the delayed reaction. So it's not like where you eat shellfish and immediately your mouth like blows up if you have that shellfish allergy. There's kind of a trend where it's usually like 2 to 8 hours after you ingest, then you start to see the reaction. And the delayed reaction doesn't mean reduced severity either. It could be anaphylactic shock that sets on 3, 4, 5 hours later. And they actually think it's tied to how our body digests fat because it takes longer for fat. If for those who kind of like the science nerdy type stuff, when we digest fat in our GI tract, it's not directly going into the bloodstream. It kind of bypasses the liver and then it ultimately reaches our bloodstream to get those nutrients where they need to go. And so maybe that's why we actually start to see some of this delayed reaction because our body digests fat in a different way, which is really fascinating if you dig into it some.
Well, it'd be fascinating not only the delay, but it would also mean what was being consumed with that other food at the same time. Yeah, for sure. So I think a question, if people are listening before we get into label reading, they're like, so if I get a Lone Star tick bite, am I immediately going to create this allergy? And I'm kind of based on what you know.
Yeah, so I would say not every Lone Star tick bite leads to alpha-gal syndrome. Some people suggest that maybe it's acquiring multiple bites over time. That leads to it. Again, going back to the inconsistency here, it could be a bite or a couple bites that maybe you got in June when you were out for a hike on vacation, and then maybe you don't even present symptoms until September, October. And we're not going to be very good at connecting the dots there of thinking, oh, this is tied back to that. So I will say if you do find a Lone Star tick on you, to remove it as quick as possible, to just delay to shorten the amount of time that you are potentially exposed. So this is if you come in from outside, if you're farming, and we've got entomologist specialists who talk about tick bite prevention and those types of things, but immediately coming inside, taking a shower, throwing your clothes into a hot dryer for like 6 to 10 minutes to kill any that have been on you, you're going to reduce the likelihood of potentially developing a sensitization the least amount of time that tick is on you.
I'm just curious, is there, because I hadn't really heard about it, but is there, like if I had a tick bite and is there any test that can be done to either say it's just kind of like a wait and see, I suppose?
There is no, I think that's a misconception. There are other tests that can be run to look at pathogens that maybe a tick is carrying, think Lyme disease, those types of things, Rocky Mountain spotted fever. But there is no testing for alpha-gal, so sending in a tick to see if it has alpha-gal syndrome, that doesn't exist and isn't something that we can do. Being mindful, if you have that tick bite and there's maybe you have a reaction at the site of the bite where there's maybe the redness that comes with it, that I think there may be some science to say that your immune system was really activated. So being mindful or paying attention after that. But I don't know of any studies out there that have really explored that deeply.
So let's, good to know, and I think you agree. Anytime we see a bite or anything where it swells a little bit at the, you have a higher sensitivity to it. So that's a good warning right there. So let's explore a little bit more. I guess from our area that we can really talk about for sure is when we look at some of the, we've talked about quote red meat, and that's pretty. Red meat, we know what it is, and the fattier the meat product, and then the dairy foods. But then that becomes a little difficult when we start going, oh, well, whole foods are easier to eliminate. But then if I'm going to get into foods like where there's a multiple ingredients and thinking, oh, gelatin, that's an issue. So some insights on labels and things to realize that didn't think about that.
Correct. So again, kind of going back to like those with alpha-gal syndrome are like, I wish it was just like the red meat and that was all, because I think the majority of the frustration comes from having to become this expert label reader. And there are so many chemicals and ingredients that we use routinely in our processed foods that are derived from mammals. So gelatin is a perfect example, because if you look at a list of like, these are foods you need to be mindful of, you might see marshmallows on there and you're like, well, that doesn't come from a mammal. But actually the ingredients to make the marshmallow does come from mammals. So it could potentially be a trigger or an exposure to the allergen itself. And so the other tricky piece of this is there are a lot of these common food additives and ingredients that could be derived from plants or they could be derived from mammals, but the label's not going to tell you that. So that can make it complicated because you're like, well, I don't know if that stearic acid came from, that's an ingredient on the list, where that came from. We are seeing more, and it's a trial and error because too, there's so many different definitions for how we label food. So even vegan. So you're like, oh, vegan, this has to be safe. There's no mammals. But I would probably encourage people, if they're only choosing vegan foods or maybe packaged foods that are like, you don't have to be vegan to have alpha-gal syndrome. But if you're looking for packaged foods that say vegan to try to ensure that it's a safer option for you, I would want to ensure that it has a vegan certified seal, because that means it's been third-party tested. And so there's really not a regulation around how some of this language can just be put on a label. And so you just kind of have to learn. Same for dairy. So maybe something says non-dairy. That technically doesn't mean that there's no dairy that's a part of it. You want to see dairy-free. Dairy-free is the regulated term. So we have an excellent extension publication that really kind of talks through some of the nitty-gritty of like, what is labeling? What are some of the key terms I should be mindful of? What are some of the ingredients I need to be mindful of? Because just like you said, gelatin is very common, not only in foods, but also in personal care products. Glycerin, some of our fatty acid species that might be added to things, natural colors, natural flavorings. So some of those, just being mindful, you really do have to be somewhat of a label reading expert when you're choosing foods that are packaged and processed.
Now, let's hear from Mindy Herman, registered dietitian, food and nutrition writer, and a guru on all the latest food trends.
Hey, Marianne. As you know, eating beef, as well as lamb, pork, and dairy, can trigger the allergic reaction alpha-gal. Americans are avid beef eaters, and the new dietary guidelines encourage eating even more. According to the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, the average American already eats plenty of protein daily, about 97 grams for men and 69 grams for women. Surveys from Innova Market Insights repeatedly show that U.S. consumers prioritize protein and they like to eat even more. According to USDA, chicken is the dominant meat consumed in the U.S., followed by beef, which has dropped since the 1990s, and then pork. 1/4 of meat consumed in the U.S. is processed meats, like bacon, sausage, and deli meats. Can you guess who eats the most meat? N. Haynes says the largest group of beef eaters are men between the ages of 50 and 65.
Now, let's return to our conversation. Well, and I will tell you, because I can attest to that, having seen the webinar that you gave last year, and I wrote, thanks to you all, I wrote some blogs, but you as well to it, because you really do have a really good resource, and for those of you listening, we will have it. We will remind you at the end, but also we will post it on the. We'll also post it in the episode show notes so that you can be able to access it.
Talking about the kind of the ingredients label, but even just thinking about how many common foods we have here in Kentucky and in the Southeast that I'm thinking of how my family makes green beans. Green beans are safe, but they are certainly using lard or bacon grease, right? To saute those or pan fry those, or, to simmer them. So even just thinking about those other byproducts from mammals that aren't necessarily meat, so your gravies, your broths, your bouillons, all of those count. All of those are most likely going to be an exposure of alpha-gal for somebody.
So I have a question as I was prepping this, and I was like, oh, it's strawberry season. And how I make my typical fresh strawberry pie is with, guess what? With strawberry gelatin. So how would I make that strawberry pie?
So I will say, with the interest in plant-based diets and eating patterns, there are more and more vegan alternatives that are emerging. So that is something you could explore. But first that comes to mind for me would be maybe agar, which is a derivative from seaweed, or even pectin potentially could be another option for you. You might have to do some trial and error to see if it turns out the right texture that you want and what you're expecting. But luckily, there are lots of options, and even if you don't have direct access to a grocery store that has those items, you might be able to even find them online, and they could be mailed to you as well. But I am very much looking forward to my first slice of strawberry pie.
So there are ways. That's the good thing. There are ways. And to your point, as I was mentioning to you years ago, I started working with an allergist on some of the food allergies, and trying to find some of these alternatives was so difficult. And now it's much easier, even online, because after all, a certain carrier carries everything. So you can always find
That is very true.
anything. Well, a couple questions. We know in the normal food if someone has a other food allergy, whether you mentioned to soy or dairy, it's not only what you consume, but a lot of times it's also the cross-contamination. And so I'm curious, is that, if you're not eating the red meat, but if the vegetables next to the red meat, is there a crossover there like there is in other, or could be potentially?
Yes. So I would say the same way that maybe you treat someone who has a peanut allergy that lives in your home or in a kitchen, or even thinking about a restaurant, or maybe even someone who has celiac and really trying to eliminate, gluten exposure. The same would be true for alpha-gal syndrome. So I would be mindful of, there have been anecdotal reports of even people who are potentially the primary grocery shopper, and they have alpha-gal syndrome, but those in their family do not. And so they still do purchase mammalian-based food. So maybe they purchase bacon for their family to enjoy, and they can't have it, but just touching the packaging, the exposure to touching it could cause a reaction. Another thing that I would kind of point out is fumes. That's not necessarily something that is as common with other food allergies, but there is some science that's starting to emerge, and we've heard it a lot from people anecdotally, that they are triggered by fumes from foods that have alpha-gal syndrome in them. So imagine kind of like taking the lid off of a crock pot that has a roast and you kind of hit in the face with that steam and with that smell that actually that might cause people to have some itchy eyes or like a closing of their throat. I've even heard from some people who on Friday night, go to a high school football game and they're mindful of where the grill is for the concession stand because even just being downwind of whatever's being grilled, whether that's burgers or hot dogs, actually starts to cause what would seem like kind of your typical allergy with, scratchy throat and your eyes watering, those types of things. So I believe there's been one study that's kind of documented that in a formal way, but that is very consistent to hear that food preparation, how we store our food, maybe having pans or pots or even dish towels that are kind of specific to an individual who has the alpha-gal syndrome, because ultimately what we want to try to do is eliminate as much exposure as possible to those triggers, because not only do we not want them to be well and not to have a reaction, but also reducing any subsequent exposure increases the likelihood later on that potentially foods containing alpha-gal could be reintroduced to the diet, which is incredibly important in a path that we're trying to explore a little bit better.
Well, and that leads to my next question, because I think if anything, we definitely have set people up to for attention in regards to this. And so if I get a tick bite and I get the alpha-gal syndrome, is there, so to speak, a light at the end of the tunnel that this is not lifelong? And I have heard stories, and I know you have definitely worked with individuals out in the community. So love to hear what the experiences have been.
So that's like the first question a lot of people ask is this allergy forever? Like, will I ever be able to eat a steak again? And I will say there is some promising data that's been published to say yes. So in individuals who are able to completely eliminate any subsequent exposure to the allergen, especially any subsequent tick bites, there's a small group of individuals, I think it was a percentage of around 12 to 15% of people who were able to reintroduce alpha-gal into their diet after about 3 to 5 years. And so it requires vigilance and hard work. But there is, and that was in a smaller sample. So maybe if we can start to explore this on a larger scale, we can understand a little bit more of the how and the why maybe certain people are more susceptible, or what are those additional risk factors we need to be mindful of and eliminate those, then maybe we might see that percentage grow over time. But right now, there really is some preliminary data to suggest that if people are mindful, reduce the subsequent exposure, especially those additional tick bites, that there is a light at the end of the tunnel for reintroduction.
I also know that from an anecdote standpoint, a daughter of one of our friends has been able to reintroduce dairy. And so there is some, obviously, as we kind of said earlier, it's very individualized.
Right. I think with awareness is growing, funding opportunities to specifically look at alpha-gal syndrome are starting to emerge. I do think we will truly have a better understanding in the next few years, kind of like maybe parallel to some of our other food allergies. So thinking about like the egg ladder, where you start to slowly reintroduce. I think we will start to see potentially interventions that look like that to try to see if we can help build people's tolerance. I do think dairy might be a natural way to kind of expose, especially starting maybe with the, things made with non-fat milk and then slowly building up. I think there will be much more to learn in that space in the next 5 years.
So with all this discussion about beware, I know you have children and you don't keep them inside the house the whole time. So as a mom, as well as one and an individual who likes to be outside, just what's the basic rules that of being able to still enjoy the outdoors?
That's so funny you say that, because we literally have door alarms on our house, because I think my boys just like run outside and I'm like, which one was that one? I don't know. So at least someone's out of the house. You're right. Like we understand the benefits of being outside play, just exposure to nature. I don't want to stymie that for anybody, especially in Kentucky. It's so beautiful, and hiking and gardening and farming. Like it's a part of who we are here in Kentucky. I will say up until the last couple of years, this wasn't on my radar. But when we go back home to Western Kentucky and my kids are playing out in the garden all day, we're wearing long sleeve rash guards to cover ourselves. We're wearing repellent. There are lots of online resources where you can find the best tick repellent that fits your family's needs based on where you live and the type of exposure that you have. We do avoid tick risky areas. So before, maybe I wouldn't have cared about my kids kind of running through a field that had some overgrown grass, but we don't do that. We stick to sidewalks. We stick to tightly mowed grass spaces and parks, just because we know that higher brush or that higher grass, or lots of overhang when it comes to like maybe walking down a path, that is a tick's favorite place and space to be. And so we're just kind of tightening up a little bit about where our kids play outside. This is even talking to my own parents and ensuring before we come play that the fields have been bush hogged if they want the kids to run, or they're wearing longer pants with maybe they have their socks tucked in if it over their pants to kind of protect those spaces where ticks like to jump. So we are still fully promoting being outside, having fun, and we're just trying to stay away from tick risky places, and some of those simple strategies to try to eliminate ticks. I mentioned this earlier, but some people will come in from outside and immediately throw their clothes into the washing machine, hoping they maybe can kill any ticks that are on there. I will say there was a shocking discovery. There was a paper that came out, it might have been last year or this year, earlier 2026, that showed that some ticks can survive the washing machine.
Of course they can.
Yes, I know, right? But like just because they like to have that moist environment, that's what they need. Like what's bad to them is heat and being dried out. They dry out really quickly. So even coming in, throwing my kids' clothes into the dryer first on high for 5 to 10 minutes, then washing them actually is probably more effective at killing ticks instead of them coming into the home, sitting in the kids' hamper for a while before I get to them. So that would be another strategy. And then we also have a dog. A dog that is a part of our family. It's outside playing fetch, running through the grass. And so we think about how is it we protect our dog. Yes, he has been treated, but he could bring ticks into our home. And so you're going to hate this too, Marianne, but another paper came out to show that some ticks can survive inside and carpet for up 7 to 14 days. And so how is it we can keep the outside and not bring it inside? Some simple strategies to eliminate that exposure to ticks as well.
So this episode is not meant to scare people, but I think no, I think the reality though, it's a reality. It's serious. And what you've talked about, Heather, I think the key is we've talked about what happens when there's a tick bite. But as we finish up here, the importance of being mindful of prevention, just like anything. Prevention is less cost effective, or is more cost effective. So the reality is play it smart, and as the environment around us changes, we have to change to make sure that it doesn't affect us. Really,
I do. I tend to bring gloom and doom wherever I go when I think about alpha-gal, and I'm very sorry, but you're right. Tick bite prevention, it's beneficial for a number of things, not just alpha-gal syndrome, but other health issues as well. Cooperative Extension has so many resources when it comes to tick bite prevention from our entomology friends, and I highly suggest folks reach out to Extension for that information.
As we wrap up, I think the important thing here is to realize is one, as Heather has talked about, this is serious. And even though we both are based in Kentucky and we kind of say it's the epicenter, it really is a widespread issue, and one that we need to be very aware and really prevent is the first. But the reality, if we do get a bite, monitor it. As I think you said earlier, Heather, is that if it's like anything, if a bite is more red, then that's probably something to really be mindful and check and know that the next time you eat a piece of meat doesn't mean you're automatically going to have a reaction, but it could, right? And And so any last good comments, kind of bottom line, when we talk about it's summer, but it's also tick season. What do we need to do?
Well, I have a couple important thoughts that I do want to leave on, and I think it's more positive, uplifting. Is, many people, if they're diagnosed with alpha-gal syndrome, yes, it is overwhelming, especially if you have to change your diet, and maybe you've eaten that way for 6 decades, right? And then you have to make this overhaul. But there are lots of flavorful, nutritious foods that still fit in someone's diet. And so don't feel like there's nothing left for you to eat. I think that's the immediate thought of I have to eliminate all these things I love. And at the same time, there's still a lot of alpha-gal safe foods out there. So thinking poultry and seafood, because those are birds and those, so it's, there's all of that. You have fruits, vegetables, legumes, whole grains. So there are so many good foods out there so that you can truly nourish yourself and enjoy it. So I kind of want to leave on that note. And then the last piece is to find some support. So even if you yourself have alpha-gal syndrome, maybe you help take care of or prepare food for someone with alpha-gal syndrome. So maybe it's your spouse or your children. Find some support, to talk through things, share ideas. What are products that work well for your family that you could give a shot? It can be very helpful when you're trying to navigate kind of a difficult, challenging time to have people around you. So I just want to encourage people to reach out and ask for help.
Thank you. And for resources, whatever state you live in, you definitely can probably check out, especially in the areas that I mentioned, the Cooperative Extension Service. But excellent resources, though, from the University of Kentucky Cooperative Extension Service. So I'll have the definite website listed, but just know you can even Google it and just look for alpha-gal syndrome. And I just saw one too that has a great, also a 1 or 2 pager on just really giving the insight on what that tick looks like. So you can be well aware in that regard. So Heather, thank you so much for your time. And it wasn't doom and gloom. It really was the positive about, I think, going into warm weather, and we want to be outside. But guess what? We have to adapt to the environment around us. And so you've given us some great tips on how to do that. And here's to a wonderful summer and tick-free.
Yes. Thank you so much, Marianne. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. Thank you for listening, Rooted and Restless. It's all about digging deeper into the behind the scenes about food, agriculture, and nutrition. Because after all, every food has a story, and sometimes it's not as simple as it seems. Subscribe to Rooted and Restless wherever you listen to podcasts, or find us on YouTube.